What if I told you that a woman who was officially deemed unfit to fly by 3 different military review boards ended up single-handedly rescuing 12 missing pilots from certain death in the Arctic wilderness? And it all started because they called her Grounded Grace, the veteran who wasn't allowed in the cockpit because, according to her commanding officers, women simply couldn't handle the pressure of real combat aviation. Captain Grace Mitchell had survived 2 tours of duty as a helicopter mechanic in Afghanistan, where she'd kept aircraft flying through sandstorms, rocket attacks, and mechanical failures that would have grounded entire squadrons. She'd earned 3 commendations for her technical expertise and had unofficially piloted damaged helicopters back to base when injured pilots couldn't continue their missions. But when she applied for her pilot's license after returning stateside, the review board's decision was swift and brutal. Female personnel lacked the necessary physical and psychological characteristics required for advanced flight operations. The rejection letter, signed by Colonel Robert Hartwell, cited concerns about upper body strength requirements, emotional stability under combat stress, and the potential disruption to unit cohesion that female pilots might cause. It was 2019, yet the language felt like it belonged in the 1950s. Grace had watched male mechanics with half her experience and none of her combat record receive immediate approval for pilot training programs while she was relegated to ground support roles at Whitehorse Air Base in Canada's Yukon Territory. The irony wasn't lost on her that Whitehorse Air Base was named after the historic World War II training facility where thousands of pilots had learned to fly in some of the world's most challenging conditions. The base now served as a jumping-off point for Arctic rescue operations and long-range patrol missions across Canada's northern frontier. Grace worked in the maintenance hangar, keeping the base's fleet of search and rescue aircraft operational in temperatures that regularly dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. Her colleagues respected her mechanical expertise. Grace could diagnose engine problems by sound alone and had personally rebuilt more aircraft engines than most pilots would see in their entire careers. But respect for her technical abilities didn't translate into acceptance of her flying aspirations. When word spread that she'd applied for pilot certification, the reaction was predictable and disheartening. Mechanics belong in the hangar, not in the cockpit, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun had told her during what was supposed to be a supportive career counseling session. You're excellent at what you do. Why complicate things by trying to be something you're not built for? The condescension was particularly stinging coming from another woman, one of only 3 female officers at Whitehorse Air Base, who had somehow convinced herself that supporting the status quo was the path to professional survival. The unofficial, nicknamed Grounded Grace, started as a cruel joke among some of the younger male pilots who knew about her rejected applications. They'd use it when she was working on their aircraft, making comments about how she should stick to the tools instead of dreaming about flying toys. Grace endured the mockery with professional composure, but each comment felt like a small knife twist, a reminder that her combat experience and technical expertise meant nothing if she didn't have the right chromosomes. Major Tom Bradley, the base's head of flight operations, was one of the few officers who treated Grace with genuine respect. He'd served alongside her brother Michael in Afghanistan before Michael was killed in action, and he'd heard stories about Grace's unofficial flying during combat situations. Bradley knew that Grace had actually piloted aircraft under fire, something most of the pilots at Whitehorse had never experienced. But military bureaucracy and institutional prejudice created barriers that even sympathetic officers couldn't easily overcome. The system's changing, but it's changing slowly, Bradley told Grace during one of their unofficial conversations in the maintenance hangar. There are people fighting for pilots like you at levels way above my pay grade. But until then, you're stuck dealing with dinosaurs who think aviation is still a boys' club. His frustration was genuine, but it didn't change Grace's situation or make the daily humiliation any easier to bear. Grace's living quarters were a small apartment in the base housing complex, where she spent her off-duty hours studying flight. Manuals, weather patterns, and navigation charts with the same intensity she'd once applied to mechanical engineering textbooks. Her walls were covered with topographical maps of the Canadian Arctic, flight path calculations, and detailed notes about emergency procedures for extreme weather flying. She'd memorized the specifications of every aircraft in Whitehorse's fleet and could recite emergency protocols for situations that most certified pilots hoped they'd never encounter. The other residents of the housing complex thought she was obsessed, spending her evenings poring over aviation materials instead of socializing at the base recreation center or watching movies like everyone else. What they didn't understand was that Grace's studying wasn't just academic interest. It was preparation for a moment she was certain would eventually come, when her knowledge and skills would be needed regardless of what any review board had decided about her qualifications. Winter nights in the Yukon stretched endlessly, with darkness lasting 18 hours and temperatures that made exposed skin freeze within minutes. Grace used these long nights productively, running flight simulations on her personal computer and studying weather pattern data that the meteorology office made available to all base personnel. She'd taught herself to read atmospheric pressure charts, wind pattern analyses, and storm tracking data with the precision of a professional meteorologist. Her preparation was methodical and comprehensive, covering everything from basic flight procedures to advanced search and rescue techniques. Grace studied case histories of successful Arctic rescues, analyzing the decisions that had saved lives and the mistakes that had led to tragedy. She memorized radio frequencies, emergency beacon protocols, and the locations of every survival cache and emergency landing strip within a 1,000-mile radius of Whitehorse Air Base. Grace's daily routine at Whitehorse Air Base began before dawn, when the hangar thermometer still read -30 degrees and her breath formed ice crystals that fell like snow in the fluorescent lighting. She'd arrive 2 hours before her official shift, using the extra time to perform maintenance checks that weren't required but gave her intimate knowledge of every aircraft's quirks and capabilities. The other mechanics thought she was trying too hard, but Grace understood that her position required her to be twice as competent as her male colleagues, just to be considered half as capable. At 28, Grace carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned respect through competence rather than rank or connections. Her auburn hair was always pulled back in a regulation bun, and her mechanic's coveralls were perpetually stained with hydraulic fluid and engine grease despite her meticulous attention to cleanliness. She was shorter than most of the pilots, at 5'6", but her compact frame moved through the cramped spaces of aircraft maintenance areas with an efficiency that larger technicians couldn't match. The hangar at Whitehorse Air Base housed 12 aircraft, 4 twin Otter search and rescue planes, 6 Chinook helicopters configured for Arctic operations, and 2 Hercules transport aircraft used for long-range missions across Canada's northern territories. Grace had worked on every single one of them, replacing engines, rebuilding transmission systems, and performing modifications that extended their operational capabilities in extreme cold conditions. Her maintenance logs were legendary for their thoroughness. She documented not just required inspections, but potential issues that other mechanics might miss. Squadron leader James Morrison was typical of the pilots Grace dealt with daily. A 15-year veteran with over 3,000 flight hours, Morrison treated Grace with the casual dismissiveness reserved for enlisted personnel, who weren't quite worth remembering by name. He'd snap his fingers when he wanted her attention, and refer to her as the mechanic even though they'd worked together for 8 months. When his Chinook developed a persistent hydraulic leak that other mechanics couldn't locate, Morrison reluctantly accepted Grace's diagnosis but made sure everyone knew he'd double-checked her work before authorizing the repair. She's competent. Enough with a wrench, Morrison told the other pilots during their morning briefings. his tone suggesting that competence with tools was somehow beneath the intellectual requirements of aviation. But fixing engines and flying aircraft are completely different skill sets. Just because someone can rebuild a transmission doesn't mean they understand aerodynamics or weather systems. The irony was lost on Morrison that Grace probably understood both aerodynamics and weather systems better than most of the pilots he considered qualified. Captain Derek Sullivan was more openly hostile. A recent transfer from a base in southern Ontario, Sullivan had never served in combat, but carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed his pilot's wings made him inherently superior to ground personnel. He made a point of questioning Grace's mechanical recommendations, often demanding second opinions from male mechanics, even when Grace's diagnoses were obviously correct. Sullivan seemed personally offended by the idea that a woman might understand aircraft systems as well as he did. "In my experience," Sullivan announced during one particularly condescending exchange, "female mechanics tend to overthink problems and miss obvious solutions. They get too caught up in theoretical possibilities instead of focusing on practical fixes." His comment came after Grace had correctly identified a timing belt issue that Sullivan had dismissed as a minor vibration problem. The belt failed during his next flight, forcing an emergency landing that could have been avoided if he'd listened to her initial assessment. The gender dynamics at Whitehorse Air Base were complicated by the presence of the 3 female officers who had achieved positions of authority within the existing system. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun, Captain Rebecca Torres, and Major Linda Hoffman had all navigated military bureaucracy successfully, but their success seemed to require maintaining distance from enlisted women like Grace, who challenged traditional boundaries. They treated Grace with professional courtesy, but made it clear that they didn't consider her pilot aspirations realistic or appropriate. "Grace needs to understand that wanting something doesn't make it achievable," Captain Torres explained to Major Bradley during a personnel review meeting that Grace wasn't supposed to know about. "She's setting herself up for disappointment by pursuing goals that aren't aligned with her capabilities or role. We're not doing her any favors by encouraging unrealistic expectations." Torres genuinely believed she was protecting Grace from inevitable failure, not understanding that her protection felt like betrayal to someone who had already proven herself under fire. The base's administrative staff treated Grace with the particular brand of polite condescension reserved for enlisted personnel who didn't know their place. Sergeant Patricia Walsh, who managed pilot scheduling and certification paperwork, always spoke to Grace in the slow, careful tones typically used with children or people whose English wasn't their first language. Walsh had processed dozens of pilot applications during her tenure at Whitehorse, but she seemed genuinely puzzled by Grace's persistence in pursuing certification despite repeated rejections. "Maybe you should consider a career in air traffic control," Walsh suggested during one of Grace's attempts to submit additional documentation for her pilot application. "It's technical work that uses your mechanical knowledge, but it's more suitable for women. You'd still be involved in aviation without the physical demands of actually flying." Walsh meant well, but her suggestion revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that most base personnel had about Grace's motivations, capabilities. Even the base's medical staff participated in the subtle undermining of Grace's aviation ambitions. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the flight surgeon responsible for pilot medical certifications, had examined Grace twice and found her in perfect health with reflexes and spatial reasoning scores that exceeded most certified pilots. But Harper's reports always included subtle qualifications about psychological suitability for high-stress aviation environments and potential concerns about gender-specific stress responses during emergency situations. The institutional resistance to female pilots at Whitehorse Air Base wasn't written in any official manual, but it permeated every aspect of military culture like permafrost beneath the surface. Colonel Robert Hartwell, the base commander, had built his 30-year career on the principle that military effectiveness depended on maintaining traditional structures and hierarchies. A decorated veteran of 3 overseas deployments, Hartwell genuinely believed that his opposition to female pilots stemmed from practical concerns rather than prejudice, though the distinction was meaningless to those affected by his policies. Combat aviation requires split-second decisions under extreme physical and psychological stress, Hartwell explained to visiting Pentagon officials during a quarterly review meeting. While I respect the contributions of female personnel in support roles, the scientific evidence regarding upper body strength, spatial reasoning under pressure, and hormonal responses to stress suggests certain positions are better suited to male physiology. His arguments were delivered with the conviction of someone who had never questioned whether his assumptions might be wrong. The officer corps at Whitehorse reflected Hartwell's philosophy with remarkable consistency. Major Frank Rodriguez, the deputy commander for flight operations, had served under Hartwell for 6 years and shared his mentor's conviction that gender integration in combat roles was a dangerous social experiment rather than military progress. Rodriguez was responsible for pilot assignment protocols and had developed an elaborate system of informal barriers that kept women like Grace from advancing without creating obvious discrimination that might trigger official complaints. We maintain the highest standards because lives depend on it, Rodriguez told newly arrived pilots during orientation briefings. This base has never lost an aircraft due to pilot error, and that record reflects our commitment to placing only the most qualified personnel in cockpits. We can't allow political correctness to compromise operational safety. His words carried the weight of institutional authority, making it clear that questioning these standards was tantamount to questioning the safety of everyone on base. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, who oversaw pilot training and certification programs, had developed particularly sophisticated methods for maintaining gender exclusion while appearing to follow official equal opportunity policies. Webb's evaluation criteria included subjective assessments of leadership presence, command authority, and ability to maintain crew confidence under stress, qualities that somehow always seemed to favor male candidates regardless of their actual performance metrics. Leadership in aviation requires natural authority that crew members instinctively respect, Webb explained to Grace during her 3rd and final certification review. While your technical knowledge is adequate, there are intangible qualities that determine whether other pilots will trust your judgment in life or death situations. These qualities aren't something that can be taught or developed through additional training. His rejection was delivered with the patronizing kindness of someone who believed he was protecting Grace from discovering her own limitations. Review board system itself was designed to ensure predetermined outcomes while maintaining the appearance of objective evaluation. Board members were selected from a pool of senior officers who shared similar perspectives on gender roles in military aviation. The evaluation criteria included technical assessments that Grace consistently passed with exceptional scores, but also subjective ratings for psychological suitability and mission readiness that provided convenient justification for rejection. Regardless of objective performance, Captain Michael Stevens, a frequent review board member, had developed a particularly elegant method for dismissing female candidates without explicit gender discrimination. Stevens focused on hypothetical emergency scenarios that emphasized physical strength requirements and emotional stability under extreme stress. He would construct elaborate situations involving equipment failures, crew injuries, and adverse weather conditions, then evaluate candidates' responses based on criteria that seemed objective, but were actually designed to favor traditionally masculine approaches to problem solving. Aviation emergencies don't care about fairness or equal opportunity, Stevens would explain when his evaluation methods were questioned. When you're flying through a storm with injured crew members and failing equipment, you need pilots who can make hard decisions without emotional interference. We owe it to the crews who fly these missions to ensure that every pilot in the cockpit has been tested against the highest possible standards. His arguments were compelling to officers who had never examined their own assumptions about what constituted appropriate emotional responses to crisis situations. The psychological evaluation process represented perhaps the most insidious aspect of the institutional barriers Grace faced. Dr. Robert Chun, the base's senior psychologist, had developed assessment protocols that appeared scientifically rigorous while actually reinforcing traditional gender stereotypes about emotional stability and stress responses. Chun's evaluations included personality tests, stress response measurements, and interview questions that were supposedly designed to identify pilots who could handle extreme situations without compromising judgment or crew safety. Female candidates often demonstrate concerning patterns of emotional investment in mission outcomes, Chun noted in his evaluation reports. While this emotional engagement might be beneficial in some military roles, aviation requires a certain detachment that allows pilots to make calculated decisions without being overwhelmed by concern for individual casualties or mission consequences. His assessments consistently found that female candidates were either too emotional to handle stress appropriately or too controlled to be trusted in situations requiring intuitive responses. The base's senior enlisted personnel played equally important roles in maintaining the institutional culture that excluded women from pilot positions. Master Sergeant Thomas Burke, who supervised aircraft maintenance operations, had worked with Grace daily for 8 months and respected her technical abilities, but he also believed that mixing genders in high-stress military roles created unnecessary complications that could compromise mission effectiveness. Grace knows aircraft systems better than most pilots, Burke acknowledged privately to other senior NCOs. But knowing how to fix something and knowing how to fly it under combat conditions are different skill sets. The military works because everyone knows their role and stays in their lane. When people start trying to move outside their designated areas, it creates confusion and potential safety issues that affect everyone. Burke's perspective reflected the institutional investment that career military personnel had in maintaining systems that had defined their own professional identities. The informal networks of influence at Whitehorse Air Base created additional barriers that were nearly impossible to document or challenge through official channels. Senior pilots, maintenance supervisors, and administrative personnel formed social and professional relationships that reinforced existing hierarchies and made it difficult for outsiders to gain acceptance even when they met formal qualifications. While her colleagues slept in the base housing complex, Grace transformed her modest apartment into an unofficial flight training center that would have impressed professional aviation academies. Her living room walls were covered with detailed topographical maps of the Canadian Arctic, marked with elevation data, weather station locations, and emergency landing coordinates that she had memorized down to the precise longitude and latitude. The dining table had been converted into a navigation station where she practiced plotting flight courses using dead reckoning, celestial navigation, and GPS backup systems that most certified pilots rarely bothered to master. Grace had acquired a sophisticated flight simulation setup using her own money, piecing together components over 18 months of careful saving and strategic purchases from military surplus dealers. The simulator included actual aircraft controls salvaged from decommissioned Chinook helicopters, instrument panels that replicated the exact configurations of Whitehorse Air Base's fleet, and weather modeling software that could generate realistic Arctic flying conditions with terrifying accuracy. She spent 4 to 6 hours every night running through emergency scenarios that most pilots encountered only in theoretical training exercises. Her self-directed curriculum was more comprehensive than the official pilot training programs offered at military flight schools. Grace had obtained copies of every manual, technical specification, and procedural guide used in Canadian Forces aviation training, studying them with the methodical intensity of someone preparing for the most important examination of her life. She memorized engine performance charts, fuel consumption calculations, and weight distribution formulas until she could perform complex flight planning calculations in her head faster than most pilots could complete them using computers. The technical library Grace assembled in her spare bedroom rivaled the professional collections maintained by flight training academies. She owned first-edition copies of advanced aerodynamics textbooks, weather pattern analysis guides, and survival manuals specifically designed for Arctic conditions. Her collection included detailed studies of aircraft performance in extreme cold, ice formation prevention techniques, and emergency procedures for situations that standard training programs barely mentioned. She had spent over $8,000 of her own money acquiring these resources, treating each purchase as an investment in the future she was determined to create. Grace's physical conditioning routine was designed specifically to address the strength and endurance requirements that Colonel Hartwell and his review boards claimed women couldn't meet. She woke at 4:30 every morning to complete workout sessions that focused on upper body strength, hand-eye coordination, and the specific muscle groups used for aircraft control under stress. Her exercise regimen included simulated cockpit positions held for extended periods, grip strength training with progressively heavier resistance, and cardiovascular conditioning that prepared her for the physical demands of high-altitude flying. In unpressurized aircraft, the basement of her apartment building had been converted into an unofficial training facility where Grace practiced emergency procedures using equipment she had built herself. She constructed mock-ups of aircraft control panels using surplus parts and electronic components, creating realistic training scenarios for engine failures, electrical system breakdowns, and hydraulic malfunctions. Her homemade simulators could replicate the physical sensations of aircraft emergencies with accuracy that surprised the few maintenance colleagues who had seen her set up during informal visits. Grace's weather monitoring activities went far beyond casual interest in meteorological conditions. She maintained detailed logs of atmospheric pressure changes, wind pattern variations, and temperature fluctuations that affected aircraft performance around Whitehorse Air Base. Her personal weather station included instruments for measuring visibility, cloud ceiling heights, and ice formation potential with precision that rivaled the base's official meteorology equipment. She could predict local weather patterns 12 to 18 hours in advance with accuracy that often exceeded professional forecasting services. Her study of Arctic survival techniques was motivated by the knowledge that any pilot operating in Canada's northern territories needed to understand how to survive aircraft emergencies and conditions that could kill unprepared personnel within hours. Grace had completed wilderness survival courses using her vacation time and personal funds, learning to build emergency shelters, signal for rescue, and maintain body temperature in extreme cold using minimal equipment. She practiced these skills during weekend camping trips in the Yukon wilderness, pushing herself to survive in conditions that most people would consider life-threatening. The navigation skills Grace developed through self-directed study exceeded the requirements for military pilot certification by significant margins. She had mastered traditional celestial navigation techniques that predated GPS technology, learned to interpret magnetic compass variations caused by proximity to the magnetic North Pole, and could calculate precise aircraft positions using only visual landmarks and basic mathematical instruments. Her navigation exercises included plotting courses across unmarked terrain, using only topographical features and dead reckoning calculations. Grace's understanding of aircraft maintenance gave her insights into flight operations that most pilots never developed. She knew exactly how each system responded to stress, which components were most likely to fail under specific conditions, and how to recognize early warning signs of mechanical problems. that might not show up on standard instrument displays. Her mechanical expertise allowed her to troubleshoot in-flight problems with precision that could mean the difference between successful emergency landings and catastrophic failures. Her communication skills training included mastering radio protocols for emergency situations, learning to coordinate with multiple agencies during search and rescue operations, and developing the clear, calm voice discipline required for guiding other aircraft through difficult conditions. Grace practiced radio procedures for hours each night, using scanner equipment to monitor actual emergency communications and studying how experienced pilots managed crisis situations through voice communication alone. The psychological preparation Grace underwent was perhaps the most intensive aspect of her unofficial training program. She studied stress management techniques used by combat pilots, practiced meditation and breathing exercises designed to maintain cognitive function under extreme pressure, and developed mental rehearsal protocols for handling multiple, simultaneous emergencies without losing situational awareness. Her psychological training included studying case histories of successful emergency landings, analyzing the decision-making processes that led to positive outcomes, and identifying common cognitive errors that contributed to aviation accidents. Emergency that would test everything Grace had prepared for began with a routine training mission that should have been completed in 4 hours. 12 pilots from Whitehorse Air Base departed on a formation flying exercise designed to maintain proficiency in Arctic navigation and emergency procedures. Led by Squadron Leader Morrison, the mission involved flying a predetermined route across the Mackenzie Mountains to a remote training area, where they would practice search patterns and coordinated rescue maneuvers before returning to base by sunset. The weather forecast had predicted clear conditions with light winds and unlimited visibility, perfect flying weather for the mountainous terrain they would be crossing. But Arctic weather systems could change with terrifying speed, and the meteorological models had failed to account for an unexpected convergence of atmospheric pressure systems moving down from the polar ice cap. What began as a routine training flight quickly transformed into a life or death struggle against one of the most severe storm systems to hit the region in 20 years. At 1400 hours, just as the formation reached the halfway point of their planned route, weather stations across the Northwest Territories began reporting rapidly deteriorating conditions. Wind speeds increased from 15 knots to 60 knots within 30 minutes. Visibility dropped from unlimited to less than quarter-mile in blowing snow, and temperatures plummeted to -45°C. The storm front was moving faster than any aircraft could fly, effectively trapping the entire formation in conditions that made navigation nearly impossible. Squadron Leader Morrison's first radio transmission back to Whitehorse Air Base revealed the severity of their situation without understating the immediate danger they faced. Base Control, this is Aurora Formation. We're encountering severe weather conditions not predicted in the briefing. Visibility is deteriorating rapidly, and we're experiencing severe turbulence and icing conditions. Request immediate vector for emergency return to base. His voice remained professionally calm, but the background noise on the radio transmission made it clear that the aircraft were being buffeted by winds that threatened to tear them apart. The response from Whitehorse Air Base was immediate and alarming. The storm system that had trapped the formation was also approaching the base itself, with conditions expected to make landing impossible within the next 2 hours. Ground-based radar was already having difficulty tracking the aircraft through the severe weather, and radio communications were becoming increasingly intermittent as atmospheric disturbances interfered with signal transmission. The 12 pilots were essentially on their own in some of the most dangerous flying conditions imaginable. Major Rodriguez, coordinating the emergency response from the Base Operations Center, faced an impossible decision. Standard protocol required directing the formation to the nearest suitable landing field, but every airport within their fuel range was reporting similar weather conditions or had already been forced to close due to the severity of the storm. The alternative was attempting to guide 12 aircraft back to Whitehorse through weather that had already claimed several commercial flights in similar conditions over the past decade. Aurora formation, be advised that weather conditions are deteriorating at all alternate fields, Rodriguez transmitted. Current forecast shows no improvement for the next 8 hours. You'll need to find shelter and wait out the storm. But finding shelter in the Canadian Arctic during a blizzard was easier said than accomplished. The terrain below consisted of jagged mountain peaks, frozen lakes, and dense forest with no suitable emergency landing areas for the type of aircraft the formation was flying. The situation became critical when 3 of the 12 aircraft began reporting mechanical problems that were likely caused by severe icing conditions. Ice formation on aircraft wings and engines could cause complete loss of control within minutes, and the extreme cold was affecting engine performance in ways that pushed the aircraft beyond their normal operational limits. Squadron leader Morrison was forced to make decisions about formation integrity and individual aircraft survival that no amount of training could have adequately prepared him for. Lieutenant Sarah Parker, flying one of the aircraft experiencing icing problems, transmitted a distress call that sent chills through everyone monitoring the radio frequency. Aurora lead, my airspeed indicators are showing erratic readings, and I'm getting engine temperature warnings. I think I'm going to have to attempt an emergency landing. Her aircraft was loaded with survival equipment, but landing in the wilderness during a blizzard was tantamount to a death sentence. Unless rescue arrived within hours, the cascading emergency grew worse when radio contact was lost with 4 aircraft. Simultaneously as the storm's electromagnetic interference overwhelmed their communication systems. The remaining pilots could hear fragmentary transmissions suggesting that at least 2 aircraft were attempting emergency landings, but the exact locations were unknown, and the severe weather made immediate rescue operations impossible. 12 pilots who had departed on a routine training mission were now scattered across hundreds of square miles of frozen wilderness with no way to communicate their positions or coordinate rescue efforts. Commander Colonel Hartwell found himself facing the most serious aviation emergency in Whitehorse Air Base's operational history. The weather conditions that had trapped the formation were expected to persist for at least 12 hours, making conventional rescue operations impossible until the storm passed. By that time, any pilots who had been forced to land in the wilderness would likely have succumbed to exposure unless they could maintain body heat and signal their locations to rescue teams. The base's entire emergency response apparatus was activated within minutes of losing contact with the formation. Search and rescue coordinators began plotting probable aircraft locations based on their last known positions and fuel consumption calculations. Weather specialists worked frantically to identify any possible breaks in the storm system that might allow rescue flights to launch before the situation became hopeless. Medical personnel prepared for multiple casualties and potential frostbite treatment that would be needed if the missing pilots were recovered alive. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the flight surgeon, reviewed survival time calculations for personnel exposed to -45-degree temperatures with limited shelter. Her analysis was grimly realistic about the chances of survival for anyone forced to abandon their aircraft in current conditions. In these temperatures, without proper shelter and heat sources, survival time is measured in hours, not days, she reported to the emergency coordination team. If we can't locate them before the storm passes, we'll likely be conducting recovery operations rather than rescue missions. Grace was performing routine maintenance on a Chinook helicopter in Hangar Bay 3 when the emergency alarm began wailing across Whitehorse Air Base, its piercing tone cutting through the mechanical noise of aircraft engines and maintenance equipment. She looked up from the hydraulic system she was inspecting to see base personnel running toward the operations center with the urgency that indicated something far more serious than a standard training exercise. The overhead speakers crackled to life with Colonel Hartwell's voice announcing the code red emergency and requesting all off-duty personnel to report for potential search and rescue support. Within minutes, the maintenance hangar had transformed into a secondary command center as mechanics, technicians, and support staff gathered around radio equipment to monitor the developing crisis. Grace listened with growing alarm as fragmented radio transmissions revealed the scope of the disaster: 12 aircraft missing in severe weather, multiple emergency landings suspected, and rescue operations hampered by conditions that made flight operations virtually impossible. She studied the weather data scrolling across computer monitors and recognized immediately that conventional rescue approaches would be inadequate for the crisis they were facing. Major Rodriguez's voice echoed through the operations center as he coordinated with regional search and rescue authorities, his professional composure barely masking the desperation of their situation. "We need aircraft capable of flying in severe icing conditions with navigation systems that can function without GPS assistance," he announced to the assembled rescue coordinators. "Standard search patterns won't work in these conditions. We need pilots who can navigate by instruments alone and land in terrain that would normally be considered unsuitable for aircraft operations." Grace approached Major Bradley, who was studying topographical maps and calculating probable crash sites based on the formation's last known positions. Her heart was racing, but her voice remained steady as she made her proposal. "Sir, I've been tracking this weather system for the past 6 hours, and I believe I can identify flight corridors that might allow rescue operations, even in current conditions. The terrain features create wind shadows that could provide enough shelter for aircraft operations if the approach vectors are calculated correctly." Bradley looked up from his maps with an expression that mixed hope with skepticism. He'd known Grace for 8 months and respected her technical knowledge, but what she was suggesting required flying skills that went far beyond mechanical expertise. "Grace, I appreciate your weather analysis, but this situation requires experienced pilots who can handle aircraft in conditions that would challenge veterans with thousands of flight hours. We can't risk additional lives on theoretical solutions." "Sir, with respect, the theoretical solutions are what got those pilots into trouble," Grace replied, pointing to the meteorological data displayed on nearby monitors. "The weather forecast missed the pressure system convergence by 12 hours, and the standard navigation routes don't account for the microclimate variations in the mountain valleys. I've been studying Arctic weather patterns for 2 years, and I know where the thermal currents create flyable corridors even during severe storms." Colonel Hartwell entered the operations center at that moment, his weathered face grim as he received updates from search and rescue coordinators across the region. Every available aircraft from bases within a 1,000-mile radius was either grounded by weather or already committed to other emergency operations. The commercial aviation sector had suspended all flights due to the severity of the conditions, and even specialized Arctic rescue units were reporting that current weather made operations too dangerous to attempt. "We're looking at a 12-hour minimum before conditions improve enough for conventional rescue flights," Hartwell announced to the emergency response team. "By that time, exposure will have killed anyone who survived forced landings. We need solutions that work in current conditions, not theoretical improvements that might be possible tomorrow." His words carried the weight of command authority, but Grace could hear the underlying desperation of a leader who was running out of options. Grace stepped forward, her mechanic's coverall still stained with hydraulic fluid, but her bearing conveying the confidence of someone who had studied exactly this type of scenario. "Colonel, I have detailed knowledge of the terrain and weather conditions in the search area. I've plotted flight paths that use valley wind patterns and thermal currents to avoid the worst of the storm effects. With the right aircraft and navigation approach, rescue operations are possible, even in current conditions." Hartwell's response was immediate and cutting. "Mechanic Mitchell, I understand your desire to help, But this situation requires qualified pilots with extensive Arctic flying experience. Your technical knowledge is valuable for aircraft preparation, but actual flight operations are beyond your training and certification level. We need practical solutions from qualified personnel, not theoretical proposals from ground support staff. The dismissal stung, but Grace had expected it. She pulled out a detailed flight plan she'd been working on since the emergency began. Spreading the hand-drawn navigation charts across the operations table, where senior officers could examine her calculations. "Sir, these aren't theoretical proposals. I've calculated exact approach vectors, fuel consumption requirements, and emergency landing coordinates for the entire search area. The flight path uses terrain features to avoid the worst weather conditions while maintaining visual reference points for navigation without GPS assistance." Lieutenant Colonel Webb examined Grace's charts with the professional skepticism of someone who had reviewed thousands of flight plans during his career. Despite his institutional bias against female pilots, he couldn't ignore the technical sophistication of her navigation calculations or the detailed understanding of local weather patterns that her work demonstrated. "These calculations appear sound," he admitted reluctantly, "but implementing them requires piloting skills that take years to develop. Knowing how to plan a flight and knowing how to execute it under emergency conditions are completely different." Capabilities. Major Rodriguez studied the weather radar displays and compared them to Grace's proposed flight corridors, his expression shifting from skepticism to grudging interest. "Her analysis of the wind patterns is more detailed than anything our meteorology section has produced," he told Colonel Hartwell quietly. "She's identified thermal currents and pressure variations that could explain why conventional approaches aren't working. But executing these flight plans would require pilot skills that we can't verify she possesses." Staff Sergeant Burke, who had witnessed Grace's mechanical expertise daily for 8 months, spoke up from his position near the radio equipment. "Colonel, I've watched Grace troubleshoot aircraft problems that stumped pilots with 20 years of experience. She understands aircraft systems better than most people understand their own cars. If she says she can fly these missions, maybe we should consider whether our assumptions about her capabilities are costing us time we don't have." The moment of decision arrived when a weak radio transmission crackled through the static, barely audible above the atmospheric interference caused by the storm. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Aurora 7. We're down approximately 40 miles northeast of Checkpoint Charlie. 2 crew members injured, aircraft damaged beyond repair. We have emergency shelter but limited heat source. Please respond if anyone copies this transmission." The voice belonged to Captain Lisa Warren, one of the formation's most experienced pilots, and the desperation in her tone made it clear that time was running out. Major Rodriguez grabbed the radio microphone, his hands shaking slightly as he responded. "Aurora 7, this is Whitehorse Base. We copy your transmission. What is your exact position and status of injured personnel?" But the only response was static, punctuated by fragments of words that were impossible to understand. The storms. Electromagnetic interference was making reliable communication nearly impossible, and the weak signal suggested that Warren's radio equipment had been damaged during her emergency landing. "Colonel," Hartwell stared at the topographical maps spread across the operations table, his weathered face reflecting the impossible choices he faced as base commander. Every conventional rescue option had been exhausted, and meteorological reports indicated that the storm system would continue for at least 10 more hours. The mathematics of survival in -45-degree temperatures were unforgiving. Without adequate shelter and heat, the downed pilots had perhaps 6 hours before exposure became fatal. "Sir, I can reach them," Grace said quietly, her voice cutting through the tense discussions between senior officers. She pointed to her hand-drawn flight plan, tracing the route with her finger as she explained her proposal. "The valley approach I've calculated avoids the worst wind shear areas and uses natural terrain features for navigation reference. Aircraft 7 went down in the Ogilvy River Valley, and there's a series of thermal updrafts that create a flyable corridor even in current conditions. Hartwell's response reflected months of institutional resistance to everything Grace represented. Mechanic Mitchell, we've already established that this situation requires qualified pilots with extensive Arctic experience. Your mechanical knowledge doesn't qualify you to attempt rescue operations in conditions that have grounded every certified pilot in the region. We cannot risk additional lives on unproven capabilities and theoretical flight plans. Staff Sergeant Burke stepped forward, his 23 years of military service giving weight to his words. Colonel, with respect, our proven capabilities haven't solved this problem. We've got 12 pilots scattered across 1,000 square miles of wilderness, and conventional approaches aren't working. Grace knows these aircraft better than anyone on this base, and her weather analysis has been more accurate than our official meteorology forecasts. Major Bradley, who had remained silent during most of the emergency response planning, finally spoke up with the authority of someone who had served in combat alongside Grace's brother. Sir, I've observed Grace's preparation over the past 8 months. She studied Arctic flying conditions with more intensity than most pilots prepare for certification exams. Her technical knowledge is exceptional, and her understanding of local weather patterns exceeds that of personnel with years of regional experience. The radio crackled again with another fragmentary transmission that sent chills through everyone in the operations center. Base ... Aurora 4, forced landing ... Crew chief unconscious. Losing feeling in extremities ... Please advise. The transmission faded into static before they could determine the aircraft's location or the severity of the crew's injuries. 2 confirmed aircraft down, with potentially 10 more in similar situations, and rescue capabilities that were inadequate for the conditions they faced. Grace pulled out detailed aircraft specifications and fuel consumption charts that she had memorized during her months of preparation. The Chinook in Hangar Bay 3 has been modified with Arctic survival equipment and extended-range fuel tanks. It's equipped with terrain-following radar and backup navigation systems that don't rely on GPS satellites. I can configure the aircraft for search and rescue operations and execute the flight plan I've developed within 30 minutes. Lieutenant Colonel Webb examined Grace's technical preparations with grudging professional respect, despite his personal reservations about female pilots. Her understanding of the aircraft systems is comprehensive, he admitted to Colonel Hartwell. She's identified equipment modifications and operational procedures that could make the difference between mission success and failure. But aircraft knowledge and actual flying capability under emergency conditions are different skills entirely. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, who had been monitoring survival time calculations for the missing pilots, provided the medical perspective that added urgency to their decision-making process. Colonel, based on current temperature readings and estimated shelter capabilities, we have approximately 4 hours before hypothermia becomes irreversible for anyone exposed to these conditions. Conventional rescue operations will arrive too late to save lives. We need immediate action regardless of the risks involved. The weight of command responsibility settled on Colonel Hartwell's shoulders as he faced a decision that would either save lives or potentially cost additional ones. His institutional training told him to follow established protocols and wait for properly qualified rescue teams, but his combat experience reminded him that sometimes survival required accepting unconventional solutions when conventional approaches had failed. "Grace," he said finally, his voice carrying the gravity of the moment, "if I authorize this mission, you'll be flying alone into conditions that have already claimed multiple aircraft. There will be no backup support, no margin for error, and no rescue available if something goes wrong. Are you prepared to accept full responsibility for the consequences of your proposal?" Grace met his gaze without hesitation, her years of preparation crystallizing into this single moment of opportunity. Yes, sir. Those pilots are going to die if someone doesn't reach them within the next few hours. I have the knowledge, the skills, and the determination to execute this mission successfully. I'm requesting permission to save their lives." Grace's hands moved across the Chinook's control panel with the fluid precision of someone who had memorized every switch, gauge, and system indicator through countless hours of study and preparation. The modified helicopter responded to her touch like an extension of her own body as she executed the pre-flight sequence with mechanical perfection, her fingers dancing across instruments while her mind calculated wind vectors, fuel consumption, rates, and navigation waypoints for the most dangerous flight of her life. The aircraft lifted off from Whitehorse Air Base into conditions that would have challenged pilots with decades of Arctic flying experience. Visibility was measured in feet rather than miles, with horizontal snow creating a white wall that made visual navigation impossible beyond the helicopter's immediate vicinity. Grace switched immediately to instrument-only flight, relying on terrain-following radar and backup navigation systems, while fighting crosswinds that threatened to slam the Chinook into the mountainous terrain surrounding the base. Within minutes of departure, Grace encountered the full fury of the Arctic storm that had claimed the missing formation. Wind speeds exceeded 80 knots with sudden gusts that threw the helicopter around like debris in a tornado, while ice formation on the rotor blades created vibrations that would have terrified experienced pilots. Grace's hands remained steady on the controls, making constant micro-adjustments. Based on her intimate understanding of how the aircraft responded to extreme weather conditions, her navigation technique relied on a combination of terrain following, radar, magnetic compass readings corrected for local variations, and dead reckoning calculations that she performed in her head while simultaneously managing aircraft systems. The GPS satellites were useless due to atmospheric interference, but Grace had anticipated this problem and plotted her course using visual landmarks and topographical features that would remain constant regardless of electronic system failures. The first checkpoint on her rescue route was a distinctive mountain peak that rose above the surrounding terrain like a navigation beacon. Grace identified it through brief breaks in the swirling snow, confirming her position and adjusting her heading with the precision of someone who had studied these landmarks until she could recognize them in any weather conditions. Her flight plan was working exactly as she had calculated, with the aircraft following wind currents and thermal patterns that provided marginally better flying conditions than the surrounding chaos. 20-5 minutes into the flight, Grace's radio equipment finally received a clear transmission from one of the downed aircraft. "Unknown aircraft, this is Aurora 7. We can hear rotor noise approaching from the southwest. Are you conducting rescue operations?" Captain Warren's voice carried desperate hope mixed with disbelief that anyone would attempt flight operations in current conditions. "Aurora 7, this is Rescue 1, Grace responded, her voice calm and professional despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I have your approximate position and am proceeding to your location for emergency evacuation. What is the status of your injured personnel and available landing area?" Her radio technique was flawless, conveying confidence and competence that belied her unofficial status as an unauthorized pilot conducting an impossible mission. The landing site that Grace identified near Aurora 7's crash location would have been rejected by any qualified pilot as unsuitable for helicopter operations. The terrain consisted of broken ground covered with fallen trees and scattered boulders, with slope angles that exceeded normal safety parameters for aircraft operations. But Grace had studied emergency landing techniques extensively and understood how to use the Chinook's capabilities to overcome terrain limitations that would ground conventional aircraft. Grace brought the helicopter down in a controlled crash landing that was more art than science, using the aircraft's robust landing gear and her precise understanding of weight distribution to settle onto terrain that violated every standard operating procedure. The landing was hard enough to rattle equipment throughout the cabin, but Grace maintained control throughout the descent and brought the aircraft to a complete stop without damaging critical systems or injuring herself. Captain, Warren and her. Injured crew members emerged from their improvised shelter like survivors of a shipwreck, seeing rescue for the first time. Warren's face reflected amazement and confusion as she realized that their rescuer was the female mechanic who had been denied pilot certification by the same review boards that had approved Warren's own flying credentials. Grace? How the hell did you get authorization to fly in these conditions? And how did you find us when ground-based radar couldn't track our position? Grace worked quickly to load the injured crew members into the Chinook's medical bay, her movements efficient and professional as she secured medical equipment and prepared the aircraft for immediate departure. Explanations later, Captain. We need to locate the other downed aircraft before exposure becomes fatal. I have navigation coordinates for 3 more probable crash sites and fuel reserves that will allow 2 more rescue sorties before we need to return to base. The takeoff from the improvised landing site required every skill Grace had developed through her months of preparation and study. The helicopter struggled against the combination of rough terrain, extreme weather, and the additional weight of rescued personnel. But Grace's understanding of aircraft performance parameters allowed her to coax maximum power from the engines while maintaining control despite conditions that pushed the Chinook beyond its normal operational limits. Warren watched Grace's piloting technique with growing professional respect, recognizing skills that exceeded those of many certified pilots she had flown with during her military career. Your navigation and aircraft handling are exceptional, Warren admitted over the intercom. System. Where did you develop this level of proficiency? This isn't the kind of flying you learn from maintenance manuals or ground school training. Grace's response was focused entirely on the mission rather than personal vindication. I've been preparing for exactly this type of scenario for 2 years, Captain. While everyone was debating whether women could handle military aviation, I was learning how to save lives in conditions that ground conventional rescue operations. Right now, we have 10 more pilots who need evacuation before hypothermia becomes irreversible. The transformation in attitudes at Whitehorse Air Base began before Grace even landed with her first group of rescued pilots. Radio transmissions from Captain Warren, broadcast on emergency frequencies that reached bases across the region, described flying skills and weather navigation, capabilities that exceeded anything the seasoned pilot had witnessed during her 15-year military career. Warren's detailed reports to Colonel Hartwell painted a picture of technical proficiency and decision-making under pressure that challenged every assumption the base commander had held about Grace's capabilities. Sir, I need to report that Mechanic Mitchell's flying technique is extraordinary, Warren transmitted during Grace's second rescue sortie. Her understanding of aircraft systems, weather navigation, and emergency procedures exceeds that of pilots. With thousands of hours of Arctic experience, she's executing approaches in terrain and conditions that I wouldn't attempt with twice her experience level. This isn't luck or beginner's confidence. This is exceptional skill developed through intensive preparation. Major Rodriguez found himself scrambling to coordinate ground support for rescue operations that he had initially opposed. His professional skepticism replaced by growing amazement as Grace successfully located and evacuated downed aircrew from sites that conventional rescue teams couldn't even reach. The radar tracking data showed flight patterns that demonstrated intimate knowledge of local weather systems and terrain features that took most pilots years to develop through practical experience. Dr. Elizabeth Harper received the rescued pilots at Whitehorse Air Base's medical facility, treating hypothermia and injuries that would have been fatal if rescue operations had been delayed until conventional weather conditions improved. Her medical assessments confirmed that Grace's rapid response had literally saved lives, with several aircrew members showing signs of severe exposure that would have progressed to life-threatening stages within another hour of delays. Lieutenant Colonel Webb monitored Grace's radio communications throughout the rescue operations, his institutional resistance to female pilots gradually giving way to professional recognition of capabilities that he couldn't deny or dismiss. Webb had evaluated hundreds of pilot candidates during his career, but Grace's performance under extreme conditions demonstrated skills that many certified pilots never developed despite years of training and experience. Colonel Hartwell received situation reports from regional command authorities who had been monitoring the emergency through military communication networks. The successful rescue of 12 aircrew members from conditions that had grounded all conventional rescue operations attracted attention from Pentagon officials, who wanted detailed analysis of how an uncertified pilot had accomplished what qualified. Rescue teams couldn't achieve. Staff Sergeant Burke coordinated aircraft maintenance support for Grace's multiple rescue sorties, ensuring that the Chinook remained operational despite being pushed far beyond normal performance parameters. Burke's maintenance logs documented aircraft performance data that would later be used to update operational procedures for extreme weather flying, with Grace's mission serving as proof that existing limitations were too conservative for emergency situations. Major Bradley prepared detailed incident reports that documented every aspect of Grace's unauthorized rescue mission, creating official records that would eventually reach the highest levels of military aviation command. Bradley's documentation included technical analysis of flight procedures, weather navigation techniques, and emergency landing protocols that Grace had developed through self-directed study and preparation. The base's communication center received calls from news organizations across Canada as word spread about the dramatic rescue operations conducted by a female mechanic who had been denied pilot certification due to gender-based concerns about flying capabilities. Public interest in Grace's story grew rapidly as details emerged about institutional barriers she had overcome and lives she had saved through extraordinary skill and determination. Captain Torres and the other female officers at Whitehorse Air Base found themselves confronting uncomfortable questions about their own roles in maintaining systems that had nearly prevented life-saving rescue operations. Torres realized that her previous advice to Grace about accepting traditional limitations had been based on institutional prejudices rather than objective assessment of capabilities and potential. Master Sergeant Burke approached Grace as she completed post-flight inspections following her final rescue sortie, his weathered face reflecting respect that hadn't been present during their previous interactions. "Grace, I owe you an apology and my respect. You've proven that expertise isn't determined by gender or official certification. You've also shown that sometimes the most qualified person for a job is the one who prepares the hardest, not the one with the most impressive credentials." Grace accepted the acknowledgments with quiet professionalism, focusing on equipment maintenance and mission documentation rather than personal vindication. Her primary concern remained the welfare of the rescued aircrew and ensuring that aircraft systems remained operational for potential additional emergency responses. The recognition felt meaningful, but Grace understood that lasting change would require institutional reforms rather than individual acknowledgement of her capabilities. 3 months after the Arctic rescue operation that saved 12 lives, Grace stood in the same operations center where Colonel Hartwell had once dismissed her proposals as theoretical and impractical. But this time, she wore the silver wings of a certified military pilot on her uniform, and the walls around her displayed framed commendations from the Canadian Department of National Defense, the Royal Canadian Air Force, and the Governor General recognizing her extraordinary courage and skill under impossible conditions. The official investigation into the rescue mission had taken 6 weeks to complete, with aviation experts from across North America analyzing every aspect of Grace's unauthorized flight operations. The final report concluded that her success had resulted from exceptional preparation, superior understanding of local weather patterns, and flying skills that exceeded those of many pilots with decades of experience. More importantly, the investigation revealed systematic flaws in pilot certification processes that had nearly prevented life-saving operations due to institutional bias rather than objective capability assessment. General Patricia Sullivan, the newly appointed head of Canadian Forces Aviation Operations, had flown to Whitehorse Air Base specifically to address the policy changes that Grace's mission had inspired. The events of last winter have forced us to examine whether our traditional approaches to pilot certification serve operational needs or simply perpetuate outdated assumptions about who can excel in military aviation, Sullivan announced during a base-wide assembly. We're implementing comprehensive reforms to ensure that capability and preparation are valued over demographics and conventional career paths. The Pilot Certification Review Board that had repeatedly rejected Grace's applications was disbanded and replaced with evaluation protocols that emphasized practical skills, technical knowledge, and performance under pressure rather than subjective assessments of psychological suitability and leadership presence. The new standards were designed to identify candidates who could excel in emergency situations, regardless of their gender, background, or conformity to traditional military stereotypes. Colonel Hartwell, who had initially opposed Grace's rescue mission, found himself defending her actions to Pentagon officials who questioned whether proper military discipline could be maintained if regulations were routinely bypassed during emergencies. Lieutenant Mitchell's unauthorized flight saved 12 lives that would have been lost if we had followed standard protocols, Hartwell testified during congressional hearings on military aviation policies. Sometimes exceptional circumstances require exceptional responses from exceptional personnel. Grace's story became a catalyst for broader changes in military aviation training programs across North America. Flight schools began incorporating her weather navigation techniques into their curricula, and her emergency landing procedures were studied as examples of how superior preparation could overcome seemingly impossible operational challenges. Aviation academies invited her to lecture on Arctic flying techniques and emergency decision-making processes that had proven their value under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The 12 pilots, whose lives Grace had saved, became advocates for policy reforms that would prevent qualified candidates from being excluded due to institutional prejudices. Captain Warren, who had witnessed Grace's flying skills firsthand during the rescue operations, testified before military review boards about the exceptional capabilities that traditional evaluation processes had failed to recognize. The pilot who saved my life had been deemed unqualified by the same system that certified me, Warren told congressional investigators. That contradiction should concern everyone who believes military effectiveness depends on identifying and utilizing our best personnel. Major Bradley established a new training program at Whitehorse Air Base that encouraged all personnel to develop skills beyond their official job descriptions, recognizing that emergency situations often required capabilities that couldn't be predicted or planned through conventional career development paths. The program became a model for other military installations seeking to maximize their human resources and operational flexibility. Grace's apartment had been transformed from an unofficial training center into a comfortable home, but she still maintained the maps, technical manuals, and flight planning materials that had prepared her for the moment when preparation met opportunity. Young pilots and aviation students regularly visited to study her navigation techniques and learn about the dedication required to excel in military aviation careers. Standing before a new group of pilot candidates during their orientation briefing, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her from a dismissed mechanic to a respected instructor and role model. Excellence in aviation isn't determined by who you are when you start, she told the assembled students, many of whom were women inspired by her example. It's determined by how hard you're willing to work when no one is watching, how much you're willing to learn when others doubt your potential, and whether you're prepared to act when lives depend on your capabilities. The wind still howled across Whitehorse Air Base with the same intensity that had once seemed to mock her ambitions, but now it sounded like a reminder of challenges overcome and barriers broken through persistence, preparation, and unwavering belief in the power of proving skeptics wrong through extraordinary performance when it mattered most. 2 years later, Grace received a letter that would have seemed impossible during her days as grounded Grace. The Royal Canadian Air Force invited her to lead the first all-female Arctic Rescue Squadron, tasked with developing new protocols for extreme weather operations based on the techniques she had pioneered during that life-changing winter storm. As she walked across the tarmac at her new command, Grace passed a young maintenance technician struggling with a hydraulic system that looked familiar. The woman wore coveralls stained with grease and had that same determined expression Grace recognized from her own mirror years earlier. When Grace introduced herself, the technician's eyes widened with recognition. "Ma'am, you're the pilot who saved those 12 aircrew. I've studied your rescue mission in flight school. It's what inspired me to apply for pilot training." The young woman paused, then added quietly, "Though I've been rejected twice already, they say I need more experience." Grace smiled, remembering similar words from her own past. "What's your name, Airman?" "Technical Sergeant Maria Santos, ma'am. I work nights in the simulator when it's available." "The simulator, eh?" Grace's eyes lit up with familiar understanding. "Tell me, Santos, what do you know about thermal wind patterns in mountain valleys?" As Maria's face brightened with enthusiasm, Grace realized the cycle was beginning again. Somewhere in a maintenance hangar, another impossible pilot was preparing for their moment to prove that excellence knows no gender, no background, no traditional boundaries. The most unlikely person in the room was about to become exactly the right person for the job. Again, if Grace's incredible journey from rejected mechanic to life-saving pilot inspired you, hit that subscribe button and join our community of everyday heroes who refuse to accept limitations others place on their dreams. What barriers are you preparing to break through? What skills are you developing in secret, waiting for your moment to shine? Drop a comment below and share your story. You never know who might need to hear exactly what you're going through. Remember, every expert was once a beginner who refused to quit. Your moment is coming, and when it arrives, will you be ready? Subscribe now for more incredible true stories of ordinary people achieving extraordinary things. Because sometimes the most unlikely person in the room is exactly the person the world needs most.